George Harrison placed his trust in very few people. Rising from a poor upbringing in Liverpool, he fought for his position within the most famous band in history and watched others take advantage of him repeatedly. His songs were rejected, his wife was taken away, and his home was invaded by a knife-wielding attacker. Yet none of that compared to what one individual did behind his back, someone George considered close, a person who sat at his table and smiled while committing an act of betrayal that still fuels anger today. When George discovered the truth, he never spoke to that person again. Not once. Born on February 25, 1943, in a modest row house at 12, Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool, George Harrison entered a world where getting by was a daily struggle. The home had no indoor toilet, forcing families to share outdoor facilities, and the only real warmth came from a single coal fire in the living room. Upstairs were just 2 bedrooms. With 4 children in the household, space was an unimaginable luxury. George was the youngest of Harold and Louise Harrison's children, growing up alongside his brother Peter, while his sister Louise, born 1931, and brother Harold Jr., born 1934, all squeezed into the same tight environment. The Harrisons had moved into Arnold Grove in 1931 after Harold and Louise married. Wartime rationing made everything feel even more constrained. That difficult start did not mean the home was cold. It was cramped but alive with meaning. Years later, George would describe how feeling boxed and pushed him toward music, as if music was a door he could keep finding in the dark. When the family moved to a larger council house at 25 Upton Green in Speke around early 1950, when George was 7, the space nearly doubled. It was nothing glamorous, just breathing room. For a kid like George, breathing room could turn into ambition. His father, Harold, carried his own story like a heavy coat. Before becoming a bus driver, he had worked as a ship steward on the White Star Line from 1926 to 1936, serving first-class passengers on Atlantic crossings while earning modest wages. In 1927, he jumped ship in New York, hoping for a fresh start, but returned broke. By 1939, he had switched to Liverpool Corporation buses, first as a conductor, then as a driver. During wartime blackouts, he wore a khaki uniform and drove through damaged, burning, frightened streets. When George was born in 1943, Harold was 32, juggling shifts while air raids pounded Liverpool. George grew close to him. Harold worried about those early skiffle gigs, but never shut the door on the dream, buying George clothes when he could and driving buses until his retirement in 1966, just as his son's face appeared everywhere. George started at Dovedale Primary School in January 1948. Remarkably, John Lennon attended the same school. They overlapped, but did not connect then. Just kids in different circles, the future unannounced. Dovedale ran on strict routines. Children shared inkwells, memorized times tables, and sat under the weight of rules. George hated rote learning and was caned for daydreaming, while John was already the cheeky leader. In 1954, George passed the 11+ exam, earning a place at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys, a Victorian grammar school with about 1,300 pupils. From 1954 to 1959, he felt trapped. Lessons dragged through Latin and math, and even music felt empty because guitars were unwelcome. He skipped classes, sketched guitars and notebooks, and barely scraped through exams, later joking that he failed his O-levels, except for writing his name correctly. But the Institute gave him something more valuable than grades, a daily bus ride. On the double-decker 75 bus from Speke, he began seeing Paul McCartney, a year ahead. Paul was 15, George about 13. Once they started talking about guitars, that gap didn't matter. Their conversations grew day by day, with Elvis in their heads. Eventually, Paul invited George to a quarryman practice on October 28, 1957, the beginning of a new life. George was already in love with the guitar, spending his pocket money, about 10 shillings a week, on Melody Maker magazines. He practiced until his fingertips bled, taped plasters on at night, then did it again. Hearing Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel in March 1956, while biking around Speke hit him like a signal flare. He formed a skiffle group called the Rebels with his brother Peter, but he wanted an electric guitar. His mother, Louise, never treated his obsession as a phase. She bought him his first Egmont acoustic secondhand for £3.10. When George grew frustrated, she told him to practice even at 2 a.m. She sang loudly around the house and cheered on the music, even helping him get a Hofner Club 40 for around $30. When Paul pushed John to consider George for the Quarrymen, John hesitated because George was younger. But George kept showing up. On a Liverpool bus top deck in early February 1958, he played the instrumental raunchy, almost note-perfect, clean, confident, loud enough to cut through doubt. John heard it and finally let him in. George was only 14. In 1959, he quit school at 16, choosing music over the life the Institute had prepared him for. When the Beatles went to Hamburg in 1960, George was 17, though Germany required performers to be 18. Promoter Bruno Koschmider snuck him in anyway. They played 7 or 8 hours a night in clubs like the Indra and Kaiserkeller, surviving on raw energy. On November 20, 1960, police discovered he was a minor, and he was deported the next day. Before leaving, he stayed up and taught John his guitar parts so the band could continue. By 1962, the classic lineup was locked in. On September 4, 1962, they recorded Love Me Do at Abbey Road, with George's bright guitar lines shaping that early Beatles sound. In 1961, friend Astrid Kircher cut hair in a rounded fringe style. George asked for the same cut, becoming the first Beatle to wear the full mop top. The press called him the Quiet Beatle, but that label hid what was building inside him. From 1964 to 1966, his songwriting space stayed small. 1 song on Help, 2 on Rubber Soul, 1 on Revolver. On Sgt. Pepper, Only Within You, Without You was his. He compared the feeling to being creatively constipated. In August 1965, he heard Ravi Shankar's sitar and felt something click. He bought his first sitar and played it on Norwegian on October 12, 1965. One of the first times an Indian instrument appeared so clearly on a Western pop record. He studied under Shankar, traveled to India, and explored Hindu ideas. In 1968, the Beatles went to Rishikesh to study transcendental meditation. Ringo left after 10 days, Paul after a month, John and George after 6 weeks, but rumors tore their faith apart. George held on longer than anyone. The last live Beatles concert was on August 29, 1966, at Candlestick Park, 33 minutes before 25,000 screaming fans. Afterward, George reportedly said, "That's it then. I'm not a Beatle anymore." The breaking point came on January 10, 1969, during the Get Back sessions. Paul directed George's playing with a controlling edge. John was distracted. Yoko was constantly present. George snapped calmly, said, "See you around the clubs," and walked out, leaving his guitar. He stayed away for 5 days before returning under a fragile deal. On January 30, 1969, he stood on the rooftop for their last live performance. By 1969, George had something, which Frank Sinatra would call the greatest love song of the last 50 years. It became George's first U.S. #1. On January 4, 1970, his final Beatles recording session took place, overdubbing for Let It Be. On April 10, 1970, Paul announced the Beatles were over. For George, there was relief. He had stockpiled rejected songs like Isn't It a Pity, written in 1966, and All Things Must Pass. On November 27, 1970, he released All Things Must Pass, a triple album with 23 songs. It hit #1 in the US and UK, sold over 3 million copies in America by 1971, and outsold McCartney and Lennon's solo albums combined. My Sweet Lord became the first solo single by any former Beatle to reach #1, topping US charts for 4 weeks and UK charts for 5 weeks. By April 17, 1971, all 4 Beatles held top UK chart positions simultaneously. In 1971, Harrison organized 2 benefit concerts at Madison Square Garden for Bangladesh refugees, raising over $243,000 for UNICEF. But trouble followed. In 1971, Bright Tunes sued, claiming My Sweet Lord copied He's So Fine. In 1976, a judge ruled subconscious plagiarism, ordering Harrison to pay $1.6 million. Alan Klein, the former manager Harrison had fired, purchased Bright Tunes during the dispute, leaving Harrison with no profit from his biggest hit. Meanwhile, Eric Clapton fell in love with Harrison's wife, Pattie Boyd, pouring that longing into Layla. Pattie left Harrison in 1974 and married Clapton in 1979. Yet their bond never fully broke. Clapton later organized the 2002 concert for George. On December 30th, 1999, Michael Abram broke into Harrison's Friar Park home, stabbing him more than 40 times and puncturing a lung. Olivia Harrison fought back with a brass poker until police arrived. Harrison survived after emergency surgery. He had faced throat cancer in 1997, but was declared cancer-free by 1998. In 2001, the disease returned, spreading to his lungs and brain. On November 29, 2001, at age 58, George Harrison died in a Beverly Hills house rented by Paul McCartney, with wife Olivia, son Donnie, and Ravi Shankar by his side. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers. 1 year later, on November 29, 2002, friends gathered at Royal Albert Hall for the concert for George. Clapton played While My Guitar Gently Weeps. McCartney sang something on ukulele. The quiet Beatle, who once waited in the background, had left a story too powerful to ever fade.